So let's talk about Ed Yardeni's comments in terms of whether what we saw was a bear market or not. Do investors generally perceive what happened in that sell-off as a bear market? Because it does matter, Yardeni says, for whether we see losses or gains from here.
Yeah, I think it certainly does. And I think I'd pick up on the other comment that you made there, that the market has gone through this panic attack. And certainly if you look at price action in March, you'd be very forgiven for thinking that investors had panicked during that period. But the thing to me actually is that investors have remained cautious but not panicked through this whole period. Certainly a lot of the investors that I was talking to all the way through to 2019 were in a fairly cautious position. They weren't overly euphoric, even though we had that really positive market. And even coming into 2020, when, if you remember at the very beginning of January, we were talking about a trade deal and easing tensions between the US and China, everything looked pretty positive. But investors really didn't buy into that. There was still a lot of cash on the sidelines. Now, during the March period, investors did get a little bit more cautious. Certainly the investors that I'm talking to were worried by what was going on, rightfully so. But there wasn't really any sign of panic. And I think that's largely because investors already had a lot of cash on the sidelines. They weren't in that Minsky euphoric state of mind, which when you get that Minsky euphoric state of mind and then you get a sell-off, there's then a lot of capitulation, there's a lot of forced selling, and that exacerbates the downturn. Well, that just didn't happen in 2020. And where we sit today, and again, as sort of Druckenmiller has said that you highlighted there, investors have been relatively cautious to chase this rally as well. So we haven't seen a lot of money piling back into equities, piling back into risky assets. And for me, that means that this rally has got a lot of legs to continue. And the other thing that I'd finally add on that point, I think, is that if you look at how sectors have performed, the differences within the index, actually a lot of the winners from last year have continued to be the winners in 2020. So the techs trade, the growth over value trade has very largely been intact. And again, that's meant that there hasn't been this pressure on investors to capitulate and sell out. So although it was a very painful, a very extraordinary period, it hasn't been that painful for investors, I would argue.
So I rarely suffer from the Minsky euphoria moments. I'm much more of an intermittent panic attack bear. What is the dollar's, momentum, the sell-off in the dollar? Has that, at any level, added to the equity bid story?
I think it started to a little bit more recently, but I think you've got to remember that the dollar was continuing to perform reasonably well in April when equities were rallying. Now, we are seeing a breakdown in the dollar now, and we think that has room to continue. Obviously, we've had a lot of questions about the sort of rate differential story, and rate differentials haven't largely been driving currencies lately. And I think that will continue because if you look across most of certainly the G10, the developed market space, the rate differentials have largely disappeared. But I think what has also adjusted is that you can now go and buy some US assets, such as US fixed income, such as US equities, and you can hedge the currency exposure, which was something you couldn't really do before. So that, I think, has started to put some downward pressure on the dollar going forward. And also, I think what you're now seeing is that the policy that we're getting from Europe has been more than expected, both on the monetary side, but also on the fiscal side, which was something that was a bit of a surprise. And I think that's something that can start to help the euro against the dollar. So we're looking for a little bit of dollar weakness, not a dollar crash by any sense, but certainly somewhat of a change in trend in currencies since the beginning of this year.